Murphy's an audiovisual expert, so any of these electronic things, you just have to be sure what you're doing with them. Can you hear me all right up there? Is it loud enough? Okay. I'm used to being in places where I'm standing above you and preaching down, and I can look up just a little bit and see all of you, but I'm glad I only have bifocals. Trifocals would really do you in this place, trying to see where you were trying to get to and that kind of thing. Actually, the executive minister in Southern California and Dr. McDonald sort of lost me in the Greek text there somewhere. I was trying to listen as closely as I could, and they were arguing a certain point. And at the end, when they finished, I said, I'm still confused. Which one of you is on this side and which one of you is on this side? Well, as would happen for those who really deal with the bigger and broader and more important issues of life, they were both on the same point. They were just arguing where the verb was. And so that made it a truly inspiring kind of argument, I guess. I don't know. We are going to try to do some, I hope, very interesting to you things in the next couple of days. And I do sincerely invite you to use both informal times and the formal talkback times to dialogue with me about the material I'll be presenting. It perhaps is my favorite topic that I talk about, helping congregations reach their full kingdom potential. I do it based upon a system that I've been working on for about the last 25 years. I've probably done individual consultations in about 400 churches in North America and Europe, and then have worked with a lot of different other denominational organizations, particularly at the point of congregational redevelopment. For instance, last week would be an interesting week to show the eclectic involvement. I left my home in Columbia, South Carolina, and drove about 200 miles northwest into the mountains of North Carolina to the great metropolis of Rutherfordton, North Carolina, and spent the weekend with First Baptist Church of Rutherfordton trying to help them who had been a congregation on a plateau for about 30 years with some incremental movement downward to get a new idea as to what they might all be doing as a congregation or what their potential was in that setting. I then left there on Sunday afternoon and drove 250 miles to Cleveland, Tennessee. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Church of God of Cleveland, Tennessee denomination. But I met with all the national and regional leaders of the Church of God of Cleveland, Tennessee to talk to them about congregational redevelopment. And then the next day I went 30 miles south to Chattanooga, Tennessee, the home of the Chattanooga Choo Choo. And I met with the First Presbyterian Church, where a man had been pastor there for 32 years named Ben Hayden, who had been on the radio a lot, particularly, and television too. And he had been gone, retired for 2 years, and they were wandering in the wilderness, and still are, even though I was there with them, about their clear sense of direction and next steps they needed to take. And then I drove to Atlanta, Georgia, and flew to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and met with the priest rectors of Anglican congregations for 2 days, talking about congregational redevelopment, this same topic. And so it doesn't matter what the denomination is, the message is sort of the same. There is a gap between where we are and what our kingdom potential might be. And that we need to look at some very similar issues, regardless of what denominational family we're in, that will help us try to address this. In Canada, I've worked significantly on this issue. The most recent significant thing, because I remember the setting, as you would know the setting and remember the setting, is that I did a great Suffering for Jesus at the Banff Springs Hotel in Banff back in November for the Canadian Baptists of Western Canada. And again, the subject was the same kind of subject I'm dealing with here, congregational redevelopment. And they had 300 or 400 of their pastors and spouses there for that particular event. It's an annual event they hold at that Banff Springs Hotel. And so I come to you tonight sharing a piece that I've been involved in for 25 years since I was a pastor in the inner city of Louisville, Kentucky, and became very concerned about congregations who were more than a generation old, who perhaps were not still on target with their founding dream or vision. And what did it mean to be church in that kind of setting, in that kind of place, and how could you revision or redream the dream. So I couch it in terms of helping congregations reach their full kingdom potential. Now, the way we're going to do this week is that tonight and tomorrow night, I'm talking about the core 4 organizing principles that I try to understand about a congregation, that if you have proper alignment of these principles, that it will give you the best opportunity to be able to reach your full kingdom potential. The principles I'll be talking about tonight are visionary leadership and accountable management, under the topic of visionary leadership and accountable management in congregations who are reaching their kingdom potential. Tomorrow night, I will talk about relationship experiences and programmatic emphases in these congregations. And those two sets of pairs go very much together in terms of understanding the overall system that I'm talking about. Now, it actually happens that the way this week is working out, tomorrow morning at 10:30, in that morning lecture, I will actually be presenting the system that puts the 4 principles together. We'll be sandwiching the system between the 2 presentations at night. And then on Wednesday night, I'm going to move to the issue of where I really am trying to look at the future and talk about the same kind of understanding in terms of how are we going to do it in the postmodern age. Because the postmodern age has caused a lot of our paradigms of ministry to shift, and we've got to look significantly differently at them, and it has a lot of implications with us being in a seminary setting for theological education, ministry preparation, effective congregational ministry, and that whole continuum, and how indeed that would be played out. So we'll try to cap it off on Wednesday evening with that kind of discussion. But tonight, we want to look at visionary leadership and accountable management. And those are 2 complementing, yet at the same time very contrasting kinds of terminologies that we need, or terms that we need to understand. And each of them has meaning, and for some congregations the meaning is on the first word, and other congregations the meaning is on the second word. A key word that you're going to hear me talk about all 3 nights and during the day session tomorrow is the issue of alignment. How is the alignment of these factors working together in congregations? So the first thing is visionary leadership. In order to understand visionary leadership, there's some information that you have to understand first, because before you can start talking about vision, relationships, programs, and management, you have to have some past to present foundational understandings about the life of the congregation. So as I start out with visionary leadership, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about these foundational kind of relationships. Now, there is an understanding of a master story for a congregation. A professor by the name of James Hopewell wrote a book called Congregation, in which he talked about understanding the master story that makes up sort of the past to present understandings that are fixed. They're past to present. You can't do anything about them. But yet, a failure to understand them is a failure to understand how you really can do effective ministry in the future of the life of the congregation. Now, I want to let you know at this particular point, unapologetically, but just descriptively at this point, the vast majority of the people that I speak to about the concepts that I'm presenting to you are laypersons in the congregations. And they don't understand lots of times our God talk, but they understand business talk or organizational talk. So some of the terms that you're going to see me use tonight and the other nights and tomorrow are unapologetically non-specifically religious or theological in nature, though tremendous religious and theological implications for them, because of the fact my primary client often is a layperson. So therefore, I'm using the overarching understanding of the past to present as being under the title of the core ideology of a congregation. What is the core ideology of a congregation? Because lots of times in organizations in the business world, laypersons are talking about this. And see, it is not difficult in many situations to convince pastors, clergy, people in ministry about these kinds of concepts, but unless you have an enduring leadership community that comes along with you, you're going nowhere with the concepts. So here's the way that I would typically explain it. Now, I stick in some words, and being a preacher, you see there's alliteration up there. This will preach. Get a story to go with it. You've got a 3-point outline here that you can preach. But I talked to them about the issue of eternal mission, everlasting purpose, and enduring core values. Now, what I mean by eternal mission, it might be an understanding of the basic core theology of this congregation, or what are the theological norms that they hold as a congregation. By eternal, using that modifier, I'm suggesting that the appropriate use of the word mission in this point is to talk about the ongoing, never-changing mission of the congregation. When I talk to a congregation about eternal mission, I talk about that mission that has been, is, and shall be for this congregation. When I talk about the eternal mission, I am not necessarily being congregational specific. I'm not talking only about this congregation. I'm probably talking about at least the congregations that would be in the same genre or kinship family as this congregation. The mission statement, therefore, is not congregational specific. The understanding of mission is, what is the work of the New Testament church? Or how do churches play out the Great Commission in the spirit of the Great Commandment? Or, for the average layperson, why do you get up out of bed on any Sunday morning and go to any congregation, much less this United Baptist congregation? What is it that you hope are seeking in a journey alongside a congregational expression? What do you want out of this kind of experience? And so, therefore, what is the basic character and nature of the church from your perspective? The idea of the generic mission or the eternal mission of the church is one that if you framed it in words, if you minimalized it a little bit and framed it in words, and in your congregation, and you picked it up and moved it over here and set it down in another United Baptist congregation, the basic concept would be, it probably works for them too, that same statement. They may change a few words according to their context or whatever, but the eternal mission of the church is sort of a generic or general understanding about the work of the church. Basically, a theology of the church. The everlasting purpose, though, is different. The everlasting purpose is here seeking to imply a past to present. It is a congregational specific statement or understanding. The everlasting purpose talks about the founding story of a congregation that still seems to have impact on that congregation today, long after the life and livelihood of the founding people. For example, certainly the United Baptist churches of the Atlantic Province, there are innumerable churches that are 150, 200 or more years old. A suggestion in the everlasting purpose is there may be something about what was going on spiritually and culturally with the founding group that still has an impact on the church today. My son, who is 22 years old, got married on December the 9th. He happened to fall in love and marry a young lady who was a member of First Baptist Church of Charleston, South Carolina. First Baptist Church of Charleston is over 330 years old. It was started actually in Kittery, Maine. William Screven was the pastor at a certain time, and after following religious persecution and economic downturns and some what they thought was bad weather in the winter, a certain number of the people, little did they know, a certain number of the people loaded themselves on a boat and moved from Kittery, Maine to Charleston, South Carolina, and reestablished themselves as the First Baptist Church of Charleston. Now, somebody told me last year that there's a little different side to that story, and it is that 330 years ago, they took with them on the boat what they knew then as a snow shovel, and at every port of call, they would stop and go ashore and ask the people what it was, and as long as people could tell them what it was, they got back on the boat. And when the people had no earthly idea what it was, they said, "This is where we're going to stay." I think that's an apocryphal story somewhere. It's a good story, but it's apocryphal. Somewhere there. I had the opportunity about a decade ago to do some strategic planning work with the First Baptist Church of Charleston. And I want you to know, and this isn't a preacher story, it's true, that literally... Y'all know those, right? Yeah. Literally, somebody in one of the committee meetings said, I wonder how William Screven would have handled this. Man had been dead more than 300 years. They were still calling his name in committee meetings. We did a study in South Carolina where I worked on that regional denominational staff for about 14 years. We did a study 11 years ago where we took our 1,800 some odd churches, some more odd than others, and we categorized them according to when they were founded. There was a book written by a United States historian by the name of Arthur Schlesinger Jr. that looked at the cycles of the history of the United States and suggested that there were 17 and 34-year patterns to the cycles of American history from 1840 forward. So we took our churches and categorized them according to which one of those cycles they were started in, to try to see if there was something about when they were founded that would seem to have still be having an impact on them right now. And we discovered some amazing things that were impacting those churches in the early 1990s, regardless of when they had started. And we found that the most typical group of congregations were those started in 1925 through 1942. Now think about what might have been happening in the world in that period of time that would impact the founding of a congregation. Well, the Depression era. Well, how did the Depression era impact these congregations? Well, they had a huddle mentality. Of all the groupings of congregations, they had the smallest number of members on the average, the smallest attendance on the average, the smallest budgets, the smallest amount of land, and the smallest buildings. All in that, and no debt. That was the other thing. Had no debt. And that was all a part of the cultural fix. But in 1990-91, when we were doing this study, there weren't many, if any, of those founders who were still leaders in those churches. And yet that was still true of them then. Now, a denominationally specific thing that would impact the congregation started in South Carolina in 1925 to 1942, affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention, is this. It was in 1925 that Southern Baptists established their United Global Missions Offering, the cooperative program. And when that was started, there was this idea, this ethos that people tried to put in place as a new ethos, of that congregations would give 50% of their offerings to missions. And that 50% of the offerings given to missions would go to missions outside of the United States. In the early 1990s, some of these churches were still giving as much as 30 to 35% of their offerings to missions, because they had been established during those 17 years after that was established as a norm. Now, not many churches that were in existence before that did that. But these churches did, because it was a part of their founding story. So the everlasting purpose has to do with the founding story of a church, and hear this carefully, that tends to be established during the first 5 to 6 years of its existence, that tends to impact it long past the life and livelihood of the founding members. The eternal mission was not congregationally specific. The everlasting purpose is congregationally specific. The third part of the past to present story of a congregation you have to understand in order for visionary leadership to be effective are the enduring core values. The enduring core values are the past to present values that a congregation has. Now, you're hearing a lot of talk in congregational life about core values these days. As I observe it, I tend to see 3 different kinds of lists of core values. The first kind of list are fantasy statements of what the congregation wishes were its values. And those tend to be the most popular statements you see these days, but those statements in reality seem to have a humongous gap. The second set that I see are very purposeful core values that congregations are living out. You particularly see this in newer congregations or congregations that have been through a significant redevelopment passage. But the third kind are the kind I'm talking about here. These are the unwritten core values that characterize the cultural life of this congregation. And they're unwritten, but they're right underneath the surface. And it's not that difficult to get congregations to brainstorm them and actually talk about what some of those core values might be. Sometimes it's the way they worship. Sometimes it's a commitment to missions, a commitment to evangelism, a commitment to a certain age group ministry, a connection with a community concern, or something like that. Probably the most dramatic example I've ever seen was a church where one of its core values from about the mid-1920s forward had been that its pastor would be known as the most outstanding preacher in any church of any denomination in a three-state region. Not all of the states, but a three-state region. And from 1925 to about 1995, they had 4 pastors of this church during that 70-year period of time. And all 4 of those pastors met that core value. In 1995, they called his pastor a person who couldn't preach his way out of a wet paper sack. And he was a good person, a good minister in many ways, but preaching was not his gift. The pastor search committee had felt like we needed a change. But what they didn't realize was that change would break one of the core values of that congregation. A core value is something that when it is no longer present in the congregation, you feel like a portion of your body has been cut out and isn't there anymore. And it's very painful for the people. Now, there are a lot of things that congregations value. If you were all from the same congregation and we were to brainstorm all kinds of things you value about your relationship with this fictitious congregation that you're gathered here to be a part of, we may come up with 50, 60, 70 things. But if I said to each one of you, what are the 5 to 7 things up here on this board that we've listed, that if they weren't present, it would feel like this wasn't the same church? Very easily, I've found in every church I've worked with, we can come up with that list. We'll do maybe 3 rounds of prioritizing. And the people will say, yeah, that's it. Those are the things that make us what we are. Well, those are the enduring core values. These 3 things, eternal mission, everlasting purpose, and enduring core values, together form the core ideology or master story of those congregations that represents its past to present. The core ideology of a congregation does not change much, often, or fast, or it is not core. It's just a collection of nice ideas. And when a new pastor comes into a congregation, he or she must understand that the 60, 40, 20 people in that congregation are keepers of the key of the core ideology. Now, the 60, 40, 20 people are people who are at minimum 60 years old, have for at least 40 years been on a Christ-centric faith journey, and have for at least 20 years been a member or connected with this congregation. 60, 40, 20 people. And in order for them to give long-term permission for change and transition, you must show that you know about, understand, and respect the core ideology. But you don't have to agree with it. They do not require that you agree with it, but they require that you understand and respect it. And that you're able to paraphrase and know it. Then you can have long-term permission to engage in visionary leadership activities. There are more definitions for vision than I can think of. Every book you open up, there's some kind of definition of vision. In visionary leadership, I would call vision the current understanding of God's spiritual strategic direction for a congregation that is cast, in a sense of fishing casting, cast by leadership and owned by membership. The current understanding of God's spiritual strategic direction for a congregation. Now let's be plain at this juncture. Vision is not a 15-word or less statement that is memorized and printed on the worship folder. That's a vision statement. I know a lot of congregations that have vision statements and no vision. I also know a whole lot of congregations that have tremendous vision, but they haven't minimalized it into a 15-word or less statement yet, and may never. I know a few congregations who both have vision and a statement that seems to be an active, empowering reflection of that vision. There are certain characteristics of a vision. It's God's spiritual strategic direction for the congregation is number one. In other words, it's not just some words or some nice ideas that we read in a book and we put down. You see, vision is something that you cast and you cast and you cast in a congregation until you are captivated by it. You don't catch vision. You are captivated by vision. You catch or get neat statements. But being caught by or being captivated by vision is indeed a full sensory experience. A full spiritual experience in the life of a person or congregation. Vision inspires enthusiasm and movement. One of the key words that you will hear me discuss or use a lot during this week is the word movement. You see, in this postmodern era, we're going to be talking a whole lot more, not about the next steps organizations take, but the movements of people within our congregations, in the development of a new sense of community. Vision must be widely owned and not just declared by leaders. Vision is something that we don't just accept because the leader tells us this ought to be our vision. Vision, more and more, is something that we feel positive, passionate, fall on our sword, with the biblical analogy of sword, commitment to. Vision is future-oriented. And understanding vision is future-oriented, I would want to say to you that vision is a future towards which God is pulling you, and not a future towards which church leaders are pushing you. It is future-oriented in that you feel that you are a part of a God movement in your place. And not even because a denominational person, even a Harry Gardner tells you this is where you ought to be headed. You are pulled toward it in a strongly magnetic way. And a future vision has to be evaluated one congregation at a time. It is not possible for me to stand here and say, this ought to be the vision of your church. Lord, I don't know the spiritual giftedness of the collection of people that God has placed there. I don't know your specific context. But I know that whatever your vision is must be appropriate for the congregational context and the pre-Christian, unchurched, and hurting people that God has placed in your way and asked you to minister to. When it comes to casting vision, vision is most effectively cast by an enduring visionary leadership community led by the pastor. More and more, one of the other words you're going to hear me talk a lot about this week is the word community. More and more, increasingly, more widespread, however we want to modify it. Vision is going to be something that a community of people shares with reckless abandonment in gaining broad-based ownership in the life of the congregation, and not something that the pastor declares. Now, we've got a very interesting tightrope to walk here. It is extremely important that the pastor serve in the role as an initiating leader. Being pastor and being a leader are intertwined with one another. But the best of pastors will lead an enduring leadership community of people unless their goal is to make this church successful during the course of their ministry. if their goal is to enable this church to be continually faithful to the Great Commission and the Spirit of the Great Commandment, they'll build up a community of leaders who become carriers of it. It is actually, in my idea, a higher realm of leadership when we're not afraid to give away leadership. When we feel like we have to grab it for ourselves, that's only a secondary level. The first level, unfortunately, is the passive level where we say, well, whatever the congregation's dreams are my dreams. But ultimately, for both the congregational lay and ministerial program staff leadership and the pastor to be excited about the future that God is emerging and to be on a journey together in the discovery and the fulfillment of that vision, that's the place of, I think, of greatest possible leadership. But the idea does say, that I think is important, is where does leadership come from? I think leadership is from God. Or where does the vision come from? The vision comes from God. It is not just the pastors again. I believe that God effectively, regularly, faithfully is seeking to impart His vision to the body of the church. It is my hope that the typical pastor would be so in tune in their walk with God that they would be one of the first, if not the first person to recognize the vision that God is casting. And would become a part of casting that vision in their congregation. But the vision may first be felt, seen, expressed, verbalized by a layperson. As God speaks to the body, the church. How do you develop vision? Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics and procedures later in the week, but vision is something that is developed generally incrementally. Now, every once in a while you see God do what I call the triple D, the direct, dramatic, divine intervention. But in the vast majority of the churches, it is in many ways a permeation principle. As people one-on-one, small groups, begin to talk about what God appears to be doing in our midst, and it begins to grow from there. Sometimes it is a rush of the Spirit. Sometimes it is a dramatic turn of revival. But often, for most of us, it's an incremental process that tends to happen to our church. How do you cast vision? Well, you cast it publicly, you cast it often, you cast it regularly, and you never feel like you have finished casting it. My own congregation in Columbia, South Carolina, has a vision and mission statement that our staff is continuing to massage and to cast before us. And it's permeating new levels of the congregation every month or so, and it's just interesting to see how it's happening. How do you know when you have vision? Well, here's the technical definition of how you know when you have vision. You have vision when 20 to 25% of your quad A's can answer the Walmart question and then make decisions in the congregation based on that. Anybody have any questions about that? Yeah. Oh, okay. If 20 to 25% of your quad A's are the average number of active attending adults. The average number of active attending adults. Let's say your congregation averages in Sunday morning worship 135 people. But about 100 of those people are 18 years of age and above. Those 100 in average attendance are your quad A's. So if 20 to 25 people out of an average quad A attendance of 100 can answer the Walmart question and the church then makes decisions based upon that, then it's a fairly good indication you have vision. Now what's the Walmart question? You're in a Walmart shopping, or pick another favorite store, or you stop by Tim Hortons for a coffee and pastry or something like that, and you encounter a person who has visited your congregation several times recently, and you're engaging them in conversation, and eventually the conversation gets around to church talk. and they indicated to you that their family household is still trying to make a decision about what church to affiliate with. They've been in the community about 8 or 9 months. They said, I'm so glad I ran into you. I was talking to my husband about this last night. Tell me, what is it that is so special and unique about your congregation? Whoa, they hit your hot button. You smile, you get real proud, and in your own words you say to them, well, at our congregation and then you tell them the vision. 2 or 3 days later, you're with several of your friends from the church and you're telling them about the encounter, and they say, well, what did you say? And you tell them what you said, and they say, yeah, that's it. Now we use a few different words. Yeah, you got it, brother. If 20 to 25% of your quad A's can answer the Walmart or the Tim Horton, whatever question you want to call it, and they do so in a manner that is consistent with how others in the core of the congregation would answer the question, and then when crucial decisions face the congregation very obviously says, now how will this decision help us fulfill our understanding of God's vision for us as a congregation? Then that's a pretty good sign you've got vision. Creating, nurturing, sustaining a visionary leadership community. And some of the talk back on Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday afternoon, I can even discuss with you the numerology, how you know what size enduring leadership community you need in your congregation. Very quickly, I want to go through something here that I'm not going to take very much time on at all, where I want to talk about what are the characteristics of congregational leaders who are reaching their kingdom potential. Because these will be the kinds of folks that you'll need to have as a part of that enduring leadership community. Number one, you've got to have people who are clear about their identity in Christ. Know who they are as a disciple, as a believer. Are firmly founded in their faith. Are church persons. Secondly, you've got to have people who are clear about their destination. I'm not talking eschatologically here. I'm talking about the pilgrimage or the journey that they're on earth as a disciple. They're clear about the fact that they haven't arrived in faith, that they're in the process. So they're clear about the destination of maturity in Christ that they're headed towards. Number three, you need leaders who help congregations fulfill God's vision for them through intentional actions. People who want the community of faith to thrive. Fourth, you want people who are focused on helping the congregation address the human hurts and spiritual hopes of individual people. Let me do linger here just a minute or two. You're going to hear me talk several times this week about the confusion that people get in regard to Christ and culture. And one of the confusions that impacts churches, and we're going to deal with in just a little while tonight, is the confusion about whether or not we're trying to help the organization of the church be successful, or whether or not we're trying to grow people in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Increasingly, as we move further into the 21st century and further into a postmodern mindset, you're going to see a re-emphasis on what Robert Bella and others in a study about 15 years ago talked about as experiential individualism. Of people wanting to be clear and sure that they are on a personal, intentional faith journey, and that their connection with a congregation is a connection that allows them to feel that they're making progress in their journey as a Christian. Fifth, the characteristic of congregational leaders that you want in the visionary leadership community are model servanthood that empowers others. They don't hoard their gifts. They don't hoard their skills. They don't hoard their willingness. They're giving it away. They are what the consultant and author Bill Eason calls permission givers. They're proactively giving permission to others to excel in God's kingdom. Sixth, they are leaders who try to help in the process of building an enduring congregational culture with a passion for the fulfillment of its understanding of its mission. And seventh, they deal effectively with diversity. And the word diversity here is talking about a diversity of understandings of the decisions we need to make in the church, all the way to a racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, lifestyle diversity. They understand diversity. They understand that people encounter Christ and grow in faith in different ways. They understand that people have a lot of different opinions about a lot of specific subjects. But they're able to grow through that diversity. Now, the second main thing I want to talk to you about, and to marry with the first one tonight, is accountable management. The first factor I've talked about is visionary leadership. I want that greatly placed in your brain, because the most important thing that a congregation can have is a clear sense of visionary leadership that is God-inspired. It's not in the change and transition process, hear this very carefully, the first thing that a congregation necessarily needs to experience, but it's the most important thing they need to experience. The alter ego of visionary leadership is accountable management. Accountable management is the administration of the various resources of the congregation, the governance, the tradition and culture, and the readiness for change and management. Change and transition, excuse me. Accountable management, the word accountable has two meanings in this title. First of all, the word accountable means that in congregations we must have management systems that handle our people and our money and our buildings and our decisions in a responsible, Christ-like way. And that when a mirror is held up to us by the world from outside, they see that we do things decently and in order. We cannot do them haphazardly. But the second meaning that is very strong in my implication here for accountable management is that the management structures of the congregation are accountable to visionary leadership. In congregations where the management structures are in control, that congregation is becoming older and more passive daily. In congregations where visionary leadership is in charge and is fueling the forward progress, that congregation has the potential to be growing younger and more vital every day. And I'm not talking about the average age of the average member. What I'm talking about the overall vitality of the congregation. Accountable management can correct whatever is wrong, but it does not help us leap forward to the future that God is pulling us towards. It just makes sure we do it efficiently wherever we're headed. But it doesn't get us there. The key elements that accountable management deals with are our resources. I call them the 4 B's. Our bodies, bucks, boards, and buildings. Our people, both our called people, our employed people, our volunteer people. Our bucks, our financial and economic value issues. Our boards, our formal decision-making or governance, as you see there. And our buildings, our facilities. So it deals with resources, governance, tradition, and culture. Deals with our readiness for change and transition. And it deals with the ongoing day-to-day operations. One of the things that must happen in any congregation that is more than a generation old, which you'll see in the morning on the life cycle, more than 22 to 27 years old, is that it must find a way to diminish the controlling aspects of management. Now, management doesn't intend to control, but an entropy sets in on management systems that causes it to move to controlling. And the motivations of people involved in controlling management often are extremely positive. They didn't intend for it to come across as controlling, but there's a certain sense in which they're afraid. Now here, let's come back to this Christ and culture issue. in too many of our congregations that are more than a generation old, we have confused our faith in Jesus Christ with the cultural patterns and habits of the congregation. And we've intertwined them to where we can't, like I can't get my fingers apart, we can't get Christ and culture apart. And we don't emphasize in church life scripture memorization like we used to. But 60, 40, 20 people, and sometimes others too, in congregations, have memorized at least one verse of Scripture, out of context, of course, and that's Hebrews 13:8. Jesus Christ, the same, yesterday, today, and forever. And since Christ is the same, and Christ and culture are so intertwined with one another, to change my church is to change my Christ. And therefore, since Christ is unchangeable, and it's intertwined with the culture of my church, guess how open I am to change in my church? And I also want to say that there's another thing that's right under the surface here. There is a question gnawing at the life of many a person in the congregation that they do not ever want to be caught asking out loud, but it is a question that impacts them daily in their relationship to their church. You may not agree with this question. I'm going to lay it out there anyhow. You may say, I've never heard that question before, George. I want to tell you, I've heard this question because I conduct hundreds of focus groups and congregations each year. I haven't heard it phrased exactly in the neat packaged way I phrased it, but I've heard it said, if my church doesn't exist with vitality at the time I die, do I go to heaven? You see, Christ and culture can get so intertwined that the livelihood, vitality of my congregation and my relationship to God through Jesus Christ become inseparable. Therefore, my opposition to change, you must understand, is not my opposition to change. I'm scared. At a time in my life when I need stability, I'm scared of what you want to do with my church. Management can either be controlling or empowering. I would simply ask you, how is it being expressed in your church? To diminish the controlling aspects of management, you create an urgency. You understand some of the tendencies that will go on in congregations for the church to become more controlling. And you utilize some effective tactics such as these. Here are some tactics to diminish controlling management. It is by asking questions. It isn't necessarily by making declarations. And so often those of us who are clergy persons really blow it in terms of the change and transition by being declarative rather than raising questions and allowing God's Holy Spirit to deal with the people in regard to the answers. So here are a couple of questions. In fact, I think there are 5. Just double check. Yeah, there are 5. And we'll end with these. What decisions can we make that will empower the vision and help create relationship experiences in our congregation? Now that's relationship experiences to God and one another. What decisions can we make that will empower the vision and help create relationship experiences in our congregation? Another key word. I've already told you 2 key words that I'm going to be talking about this week. One of them is movement. One of them is community. A third is experiences. Congregations of the future are congregations of experiences, not programs. And that's the topic for tomorrow night. Number 2. How can we make this decision, and this decision meaning any major decision facing the congregation, in a way that will include more people in the life and ministry of the congregation and encourage their spiritual development as disciples? So often in congregations, we make reductionist decisions. We further make larger the boundaries that define who's in and who's out of the congregation. as opposed to asking the question, how will this help us be more effective at evangelism, outreach, new member assimilation, those kinds of things. Third, how can we honor the past and embrace the future in order to be relevant to the next generations? How can we honor the past and embrace the future in order to be relevant to the next generations? You know, I've searched and searched and searched and searched for the questions that I can ask the stakeholders in congregations, generally these 60, 40, 20 people or above, that will cause them to think in a new way about the challenges facing the church. I haven't found many questions I can ask that break it open. Here's the one that comes the closest. What would you be willing to do, to allow, to give proactive permission for, to support enthusiastically, that would allow this congregation to be the kind of place that your grandchildren would want to come to church? They've given up on their children, but they're really concerned about their grandchildren. And I get more dialogue back from folks on that to say, wait a minute, it means everything to me that this is the kind of church my grandchildren will want to come to. And so they're at least willing to discuss and open up some things that they hadn't thought of before. Number 4, why do we need existing and proposed procedures? Will we be more controlling or more flexible when we adopt them? One of the key issues management needs to ask is, how can we be more flexible, be more open? I've worked with many a congregation in consulting over the last 25 years where you would find something like this happening. But this is probably the most extreme example. I worked with a congregation one time that used to average 450 to 500 attendants. When they averaged 450 to 500 attendants, they had about 20 to 25 committees, council, or other decision-making groups within the life of the congregation. Well, over a period of 20 years, they grew from 450 to 500 attendants to 135 to 145. In that same period of time, they went from having 20 to 25 decision-making units to having 33. It now took 287 warm bodies out of the 135 to 145 they had, including adults, children, preschoolers, whatever, just to fill their committee slots. And they couldn't figure out why they had all their committee meetings and did all this management and had no time for ministry. And so we turned the page and started over again. And we chose a word that wasn't in any Baptist polity book, but just one they had never used before, so they wouldn't have any baggage with it. We chose the word commissions. And we established 9 commissions that had 7 people each on it. It took 63 people. And see, what they did is, I don't care how you fit it, they're 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, 168 hours in a week. You're not making more time. There's always a finite amount of time. And so if you commit 80% of the time that people are willing to give you a week to church, which is between 2 and 3 hours, with management issues, no wonder you aren't getting any ministry done. And so one of the key issues is making our management systems lean and mean. And then you have the transformational question that was offered to us in a generic form by the futurist Joel Barker that I would suggest to you in this form. What seems impossible today, that if it could happen, would transform this congregation's ability to serve in the midst of God's kingdom? What seems impossible, never happened, today, that if it could happen, if it was a part of God's empowerment of us, would transform the congregation's ability to serve in the midst of God's kingdom. I'm going to be building for you in the morning a metaphor of an automobile. What I want you to know is that in that automobile, visionary leadership must be behind the steering wheel. Secondly, accountable management must be in the vehicle, but typically in the back seat if at all possible. I got to have both in the vehicle. I don't want a church that doesn't have accountable management. But I want it to be management that is accountable to the visionary leadership as led by our Heavenly Father. Thank you very much.